We as unenlightened beings in the cycle of rebirth, taking rebirth in any one of the three realms of existence, take rebirth through a process, take continual rebirth again and again through a process which is described from one point of view as the 12 links of interdependent causality or co-origination, which are known as the Tenro-chunyi in Tibetan or the Paticca-samutpada in Sanskrit. These 12 links in this chain are, simply to list them briefly, ignorance, karmic formations, consciousness, in the sense of discursive consciousness, duality, which is literally termed name and form in this particular system, the 6 sense fields through which the mind experiences the world, the contact between those different kinds of consciousness and their objects, the sensations which this produces, the craving or attraction which this produces, a level which is known as literally acceptance or taking, which is one step further to this attraction, leading to a process of becoming, which leads to a process of birth, and then from that aging and death. These then, in brief, constitute the 12 links of this cycle or chain. This term ignorance can be interpreted in at least 2 ways. There is a more fundamental sense to this word ignorance, or avidya, which is in its most fundamental sense the ignorance that is the basis for the whole process of samsara to develop in the first place. Something that we, as beings in this cycle, that each and every being in this cycle of rebirth experiences as part of their makeup on some very fundamental level. In this sense of the word, ignorance or vidya as the universal basis for the illusory process or the confused process we know as samsara, in this case it is simply the lack of direct experience by the mind of its own nature. The fact that there is this lack of direct experience, that the mind does not see, does not perceive, is not aware of its own true nature, is a level of ignorance, a fundamental level of ignorance.
선체적으로 동화도 영향이 많지 인도다. 동화도 영향이 풍부하고 있어요. 선체적으로 동화도 영향을 내서 인도다. 영향을 내서 그래서 선체도 소진이 제법도 그래도 말이 제법도 쉐거야 돼.
An unenlightened being, then, in the cycle of rebirth, in the cycle of samsara, the experience of that being is continual frustration, pain, confusion, suffering. This being then experiences a whole heap, a whole mass or aggregate of suffering, confusion, and pain as a result of this fundamental ignorance. On the other hand, the Buddha, a completely enlightened being, has transcended that suffering and pain, has transcended the pain of existence that an ordinary being feels. That, in fact, is one definition of the term nirvana, to pass beyond or to transcend this suffering and pain of conditioned existence. The criteria for deciding between whether we are speaking of a Buddha or an unenlightened being, a sentient being, is whether or not there is this basic awareness. In the absence of this basic awareness, this fundamental awareness by the mind of its own nature, we speak of avidya, of ignorance, and we speak of an unenlightened being. In the presence of this fundamental awareness, we are speaking of a Buddha. If we ask, where did this ignorance begin? Can we ascribe an origin to this ignorance? The only statement that we can make is that as long as there has been a mind experiencing, this mind has been experiencing through this ignorance. This ignorance has been part of that mind's experience. In this sense, we say that this fundamental level of ignorance is co-emergent with mind itself, co-emergent with consciousness itself. An example used is that of gold, the element of gold which oxidizes or begins to oxidize and form a tarnish the moment it comes into existence. The moment that there is gold, there is oxidation taking place and tarnish forming on the surface. The moment there is mind, and there always has been a mind experiencing, because there is this mind, there is ignorance present. It is co-emergent ignorance. This is the technical term which is used in an attempt to describe the simultaneity of consciousness itself and this fundamental level of ignorance. Now, given that there is this fundamental ignorance constantly, that there always has been this fundamental ignorance, what further complications has this led to? What fault has arisen due to this ignorance? The point is that, fundamentally speaking, the nature of our minds is what we term Tathagata Garbha, the Buddha nature. A state of mind which is empty, essentially empty, which is lucid and clear by nature, and which is dynamic and unimpeded in its manifestation. Now, this fundamental level of ignorance prevents, or rather is the absence of, the direct experience of that true nature of the mind, the Tathagata Garbha. Because there is this lack of direct experience, this implies that further distortions continually take place. The essential emptiness of the mind, in not being perceived directly, experienced directly for what it is distorted into the experience of a self or ego. The clarity or lucidity of the mind, the ability of the mind to give rise to any experience, is instead projected into something other than that subject or self. Therefore, we have a subject-object split at that point, at that level. Due to this fundamental lack of ignorance, the further distortion takes place of the emptiness of mind into the subjective pole and the clarity or lucidity of mind into the objective pole, which are then perceived as entirely separate and independent one from the other. This is a second level of ignorance, this expression of the mind on this level of dualistic clinging, which is termed a more conventional kind of wisdom, which labels, or which posits something which in fact does not exist. The second level of ignorance then posits a self and an other, a subject and an object, where in fact there is no such thing, ultimately speaking. They are mere distortions. They are however, taken as ultimate reality, posited by this level of confusion as the ultimate reality. Now, if one goes on to say from here, does that mean that because this ignorance has always been the case, has always been in operation, because there always have been sentient beings experiencing this confusion, is that the be-all and the end-all of the universe? Is that all there is? Does that mean, therefore, that this awareness, the fundamental awareness, never has been in operation, never has existed, we might say, or never has been on the scene? In fact, this is not the case. Just as there always has been ignorance of the true nature of mind, there always has been the true nature of mind and its direct experience. This is what is referred to as samantabhadra in some texts. The Buddha, the primordial Buddha, what is termed the primordial Buddha, or the state of Buddhahood which has always existed, which has literally existed from the very first, the implication being always has existed from beginningless time. And when one finds reference in these texts to, I pay homage to Samantabhadra, the primordial Buddha, what this is acknowledging is the ongoing existence, or the ongoing potential for this direct experience of the nature of mind, which always has been the case. The point is, from our own personal situation, we have always been experiencing these two levels of ignorance, the co-emergent fundamental ignorance and the more conventional dualistic clinging, which is the operation of ignorance in positing subject and object as ultimately real and ultimately independent identities or entities. Based upon that, there has been continual emotional confusion arising in the mind, the relationship between that subject and that object, that perceived subject and that perceived object. Based upon these very complex emotional states which develop, and the text lists 84,000 emotional states to which an unenlightened being is subject, based upon these emotional states, we act. We have always been in states of existence where the mind has acted on its own and through the body in physical, verbal, and mental ways, creating what we call karma, creating and reinforcing tendencies which continue to fuel the cycle of rebirth, leading the mind to one state after another of confused, distorted experience, rather than ever discovering that true nature. We therefore have always been experiencing the operation of this fundamental ignorance, this more conventional dualistic ignorance, the emotional confusion based upon that, and the karmic tendencies which are a result of that emotional confusion.
then such a door reach to the matter, then a bar is enough, then a reach the motion of the children. That is enough, I did it as a very true Martina, I the fruit is again. Then I read through the Martina, I was carried in a pen, I have taken the girl Matiana, not that, not to the Martin children, but not to the daughter, not to Diana, did that in Matiana, not to Martin children, but in Doria, then I told of course, they want to come in with Doria, they said that, but that, well, Master is true, this is.
We find discussions then in the texts of the 6 classes of beings, the 6 kinds of life of physically embodied beings that exist in this universe. People often ask, well, is that all there is to it? Is there only the 6? Does that represent the sum total of possibilities for existence in this universe? Well, we could add a 7th. We could say, for example, that the mind of a being in the Bardo state, in the after-death state, before physical embodiment, could count as a 7th class of being, because in fact, that the mind of that being has not committed itself or been committed through its karmic makeup to one or another of these 6 classes. It depends upon how you want to look at it. We could, in an attempt to find yet more possibilities for the mind within the cycle of rebirth, we could classify the Bardo state, the after-death state, as a 7th class. But on the other hand, the situation of the mind in the Bardo is rather like the situation of a person at the crossroads of 6 roads leading in 6 different directions, and the person is standing right in the middle of that crossroads. Now, they're going to have to go in one direction or the other. If you want, you can classify them as something separate from those 6 because they haven't yet committed themselves. But sooner or later they're going to. And the only direction they're going to have in which to go is one of those 6 directions. So in a certain sense, the mind in the Bardo state does not officially, we might say, become classified under one of these 6 realms of existence in samsara, but it must end up in one or another of those, given that enlightenment has not occurred. Therefore, there is no real point to discussing anything beyond these 6 possibilities. If we attempt to deny the existence of these 6 states of being and say, well, it's all just hypothetical, it doesn't really exist, there seems to be a certain basis, a certain reason for assuming that, in fact, these realms do exist. That when the Buddha described the regions of the hot hells, for example, as existing below the human realm, even giving very exact distances below the surface of the earth, at which the first of these hot hells existed, followed in successive order by the other 7 of the 8 hot hells, each one underneath the one before it, in a descending order. When the Buddha was teaching in this way, teaching the sutras, he was not lying. He was not making up things in order to entertain people. There seems to be a basis there for saying these realms, in fact, do exist. The beings do experience these realms in the way that the Buddha described them. It would seem then that these 3 lower realms of the hell realms, the preta realms, and the animal realms are not figments of someone's imagination. That in describing the 8 hot hells, the 8 cold hells, and the neighboring and occasional hells, the 18 hell realms, in describing the 36 classes of pretas, and describing the infinite variety of animal life, what is being referred to are actual states of existence that beings do experience.
되는 제가 하면은 자신이 이제 전화가 번호라 끊어서 진짜선 아니 타라 단테 제가 저 좋은 받고 달라리 기차도 나서 생각하겠어.
In the case of the higher realms, two of the sutras speak very extensively about the human realm, not only the realm that we are normally accustomed to calling our own human realm, but what are described as the 4 continents and 8 subcontinents, all populated by human beings, beings that fall within this realm of the human state of existence. The asuras, or demigods, described as being of 4 classes which live on the slopes of the central mountain of the universe. The 6 realms of the desire gods, the first of these inhabiting the upper slopes of the mountain, the heaven of the 33 gods on the summit of the mountain, and the higher realms of the desire realm, 4 in number, making a total of 6. All of these are described as realms of experience that beings do experience. The texts go on further to describe what is known as the form realm, beyond this desire realm, which reaches from the lowest hell to the highest of these 6 realms of desire realm gods. There are, beginning with the gods of the class known as the Brahma gods, Mahabrahma and so forth, there are 17 classes of gods in the form realm. There are further 4 states of purely mental existence, which are known as the formless realm. These are technically known as the states of infinite space, of infinite consciousness, of literally what is called nothing happening, nothing being perceptible, and the final state being known as neither anything nor nothing, a state of completely subtle mental existence in which there is no perceptible sensation at all. Now, this represents the pinnacle, we might say, of possible existence within the cycle of samsara. But what are being described here are not figments of some person's imagination, but actual states of existence that it would seem beings do experience, that there are beings at this moment experiencing those forms of existence. On the one hand, then, in discussing these lower and higher realms of samsara, we seem to be discussing things which are actually valid for the beings experiencing them. That insofar as the Buddha described them, these realms are the possible states that a mind can experience within the cycle of rebirth. On the other hand, if we say, well, then are they ultimately real? Are we talking about real things in the ultimate sense of the word? Again, we can refer to the words of the Buddha, who said, or rather to the sutras, and in one point it is said, as far as the hell realms goes, this foundation or basis of flames and molten iron and the scorching and burning by the flames that the beings experience there, where does all of this come from? The Buddha has taught that these are the projections of an evil mind, which is to say that any and all of these states of being are only as real as the mind of the being in that state projecting that particular state of existence and experiencing it as though real. From the point of view of the individual being, because it is experiencing the projections of its own mind, this is real. On an ultimate level, however, it is nothing more than, or less than, the projections and experiences of that individual being's mind. If we take something like water, the experience of water. In the human realm, we experience this substance we call water. Now, that is nothing more or less real than our experience of it. In the case of a hell being, that being would experience rather molten lead or molten iron, scorching and burning it. In the case of a preta, it would experience it as pus or blood or some other filthy or disgusting substance. In the case of an animal, some animals consider water their home. They live in the water. It is their environment, the environment in which they move. For a human being, it is simply something to drink in order to keep the body alive. For a god, it is nectar. It is a beautiful kind of ambrosia, the most delicious thing imaginable. For a demigod, it is a form of weapon, because that being's consciousness only sees things in terms of their value as weaponry or means of inflicting harm. The point is that if we try to say that there is such a thing as the ultimate experience of water, we are forced to simply conclude that it is only as valid as the human experience of water makes it. Because another being's state of mind will render it incapable of experiencing what we call water in that way. It simply will not experience that which we call water. Must we then see a contradiction in the Buddha's teachings, where on the one hand he seemed to be saying everything is absolutely real, and on the other hand everything is absolutely false? This would seem to be contradictory. What we need to understand or take into consideration are the two levels of truth. That there is a perfect validity on a conventional level of what appears to be true for a given being or given beings in a particular situation. Now that is valid insofar as those beings experience it as being true. On the other hand, there is an ultimate level of truth in which all of this can be seen to be completely relative to those individual beings and their perception of that situation, and therefore nothing ultimately true. The third Karmapa, Rongshun Dorje, put it very succinctly in saying, existence, experience, phenomena are not real or false. They are like the reflection of the moon in water. Which is to say, if you see the reflection of the moon in water, there's something there. There certainly is some very tangible, perceptible, brilliantly apparent experience of the moon in the water, which is not the same thing as saying there is the moon, because in fact it is not the moon. There is nothing there. There is, however, a very direct and immediate experience, which certainly seems to be real. The same can be said of any of our states of experience, any phenomena that we encounter. During the offering of the mandala, the third of the foundation preliminary practices of the Ngundro, there is this cosmology then which is described of the universe, of a world system with an enormous mountain, Mount Sumeru, in the center, with 4 stages forming the basis, with the realm of the gods on the summit, with the 4 continents and the ocean surrounding it, the 7 rings of mountains and so forth. A very beautiful, very symmetric world system which is described in all of its glory, in all of its beauty, in all of its splendor, which is offered mentally. And then a Western person comes along with their view of the solar system and the planet Earth and so forth, and these spheroid bodies moving in space, and they see a very fundamental contradiction between what seems to be being presented as the accurate description of the universe and what they have been taught is the accurate description of the universe. Someone who is leaning far more towards the Buddhist presentation, who is steeped in Buddhist practice or Buddhist cosmology, would say on the one hand, well, all this talk of spheroid bodies is rubbish. The Buddha himself described the universe as a mountain with 4 continents in this ocean around it and these rings of mountains and so forth, and that's the way it is. Someone with a purely scientific worldview would totally reject the spiritual worldview and say, no, we can go out and take photographs. We can actually see these spheroid bodies moving in space, so we know that this is real. But it doesn't seem to be a case here of one being real and the other being unreal, one being right and the other being wrong. In a certain sense, they are both right. In one sutra, the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, the discourse delivered by the Buddha prior to passing into final nirvana, the Buddha discusses this problem and says, at one point, describes the universe from the point of view of these 4 continents in the central mountain, and said that is a perfectly valid world system, a perfectly valid worldview for certain kinds of beings. There are other beings who perceive the world in a completely different way. And he goes on to describe in this particular presentation the different shapes, the different configurations of these planets or realms or spheres in which these beings find themselves, at one point even describing a realm where beings experience heaven as earth and earth as heaven, being completely topsy-turvy, and for them that being completely normal. The point the Buddha said was that as far as those beings in that realm are concerned, their worldview is right. Their worldview is completely true, because all that they perceive as a projection of their collective karma is that view. That is what they see. There is only a relative validity, then, to any of this. Suppose we, as a large group of people here in this room, all go to sleep at this point, and each person dreams a different dream. We wake up later, and someone among us insists that their dream was the real one. Everybody else had a false dream. I had the real dream. What sense does that kind of statement make? It doesn't make any sense at all. Each of us experienced our particular dream as reality while it was happening. For us, it was perfectly real, certainly as real as anybody else's in the room. One would then perhaps say, why did the Buddha feel compelled then to present this world system of 4 continents and a central mountain and so forth? It has a spiritual value in the sense that when one is offering, if one is offering the universe, as when one is offering anything else, one offers the most aesthetic, the most beautiful, the most pleasing thing that one can find. That is the point of calling it an offering. One wouldn't take garbage, something worthless or something completely ugly and repulsive, and offer it and expect that to be considered some kind of offering. The sense of offering, of honoring or worshipping something conceived of as higher than oneself, involves getting the very best that one can. In conceiving of the universe as an offering, one conceives of it in the most symmetrical, balanced, aesthetic way possible. This was the reason for presenting this particular kind of cosmology, then, to present this kind of picture of the universe as the perfect gift, the perfect offering that could be made. It would seem then that from among all the possibilities of ways in which beings can perceive their world in which they live, this represents one of the most aesthetic, represents one of the most harmonious, one of the most balanced and symmetrical plans of the universe, ways of seeing the universe that could be described. That is why it is used as a basis for the mandala offering. The fact that experience is subjective, entirely subjective in nature, that it is the mind experiencing what seems to be real out there, can explain for the fact that there is one class of hell beings described as the lowest form of life possible in the universe, and a being in that state will experience the suffering of all the other 6 realms of existence at one time in a single existence. Now, if we are attempting to concretize these 6 realms into actual physical places, and beings in those universes experiencing them passively, then it sounds a bit silly to say that one being combines all of that suffering, because the suffering is happening somewhere else. The suffering is in a realm physically separated, distant from the realm that that being is in. If we take into account the subjective nature of all that experience, though, it is perfectly possible for a mind to become so confused and so distorted that it could experience something which would be the equivalent of, the psychological equivalent of, all the suffering of all the other beings in the universe rolled up into one. In one of the realms of the desire realm gods, the realm which is known as Trulga in Tibetan, this term literally means to enjoy an emanation, to emanate and enjoy. Because what this implies or describes is that one of the fundamental characteristics of a being's experience in that state is that whatever is required, whenever there is something beautiful that one would wish to see, something melodious to hear, beautiful to taste, whatever, a god or a goddess, whatever one wanted in the occasion, could be emanated from oneself as a projection of one's mind that would be experienced as concrete reality. For example, a god or a goddess emanating forth and offering to one exactly what was required, exactly what was wanted. But that is a state of subjective experience. It emanates from the mind of that being and is perceived as something outside, which is then enjoyed. The next refinement on this stage is the 6th of the desire realm gods, which are known as Central Wangche, which means to take possession of the emanations of others. At this state, it is not even necessary to go to the trouble of emanating them oneself. Others do the job for one, and one is free to enjoy the emanations of others. With this kind of view, then, of the subjective nature of a being's experience conditioned by karma, our human experience becomes easier to understand, because within the general context of human experience, some people live longer than others. Some are happier than others. Some are richer than others. Some are healthier than others. Some have more of a basic feeling of contentment and fulfillment than others. This spectrum of human experience can be explained then as the subjective manifestation of karmic tendencies in that individual being's mind, conditioning the way in which that being experiences the general context of the human realm. It was with this in mind, then, the subjective nature of all experience, that the Buddha could make a statement, as he did at one point, that the three realms are nothing but mind, are merely mind. If the mind has woken from the sleep-like ignorance, which is the lack of direct experience of its own nature, this is the attainment of Buddhahood. The qualities, the different kayas or aspects of complete enlightenment, the pure realms in which this enlightenment manifests, all of these arise spontaneously from the simple fact that the mind is in direct experience of its own true nature. If, on the other hand, there is a lack of that direct experience, if there continues to be this ignorance and this confusion in the mind, then the multiplicity of appearances in the cycle of rebirth continue to arise as a matter of course, simply due to that lack of direct experience. Today we're discussing most particularly these 12 links of interdependent coordination. Now, one of the easiest ways to facilitate understanding of ignorance or any other of these links is to take a kind of time-scale view of this chain. Given that we are who we are at this point in this human state of rebirth, at one point it would seem that our mind was in some state of physical embodiment previous to this one, at the end of which death occurred. The process of the separation of the mind from that particular physical body in a process we know commonly as death. The experience of death produces a kind of trauma or shock which plunges the mind into a state of unconsciousness for a short period following the moment of death. Now, this is one of the most obvious examples of or experiences of this fundamental ignorance. The mind at that point plunges into or resolves back into its most fundamental state of pre-conscious ignorance, where there is no conscious activity in the mind at all. The duration of time, from our point of view, that the mind will experience this state of ignorance, this state of unconscious blackout, is a very hypothetical and very subjective question, because it depends upon the kind of being, it depends upon the particular time scale that one is used to. In the case of human beings, however, this is held to be, following the death of a human being, roughly 3.5 human days. What we normally experience is at 3.5 days, during which time the mind of a human being, more or less, will be in this state of blackout. This is not to say this is an absolute, strictly applied rule of thumb. It is simply a general statement about the conditions of consciousness of a human being following death. At a certain point, this period of unconsciousness passes and consciousness begins to stir again, reawaken in the mind. The activity of the mind begins to express itself then as consciousness, very primitive, very undeveloped at first, mere stirrings in the mind. This is the level which is known as samskaras, or karmic formations in the mind. However, this rapidly becomes more developed as an actual consciousness, an actual defined or discursive state of consciousness. So from this state of ignorance, if we are following the experience of the mind through the after-death state, there is first this state of fundamental ignorance, from which there are these first stirrings or formations which gradually emerge into a fully defined state of awareness or consciousness. In some discussions, one finds a slightly more developed discussion, which draws in the concept of the level of experience we might term sensation in the mind. For example, in the discussion of the 5 skandhas, the skandha of sensation, followed by formation or volition in the mind, followed by consciousness. So it might be possible to describe this in a little more detail and say, from ignorance the mind passes to a level of sensation, to a level of formation or volition, to a level of consciousness. At this point, though, the discussion is a moot point. It's a matter of semantics at this point. Rinpoche described the example of one's finger. There are 4 joints on the finger, and you can say that this represents, the bottom one represents ignorance, so the second joint represents, or the second knuckle represents this level of sensation or perception, and then volition, and then consciousness, and so forth. Or you can just say it's a finger and describe the whole thing in one shot. We're speaking about a spectrum of experience, and how much we want to split it up depends upon how inclined we are to nitpicking or simply describing a broad spectrum of experience. In the case of the discussion of the 12 nidanas, the 12 links of this chain, this level of sensation perception is lumped into that of formations in the mind, formations of volition in the mind, these first stirrings of consciousness. This general term refers to the whole process of passing through these different levels of perception, gradually becoming coarser and more defined. The next stage, or the next of these links or nidanas, is what is called name and form. Now, what this refers to in the experience of the mind is the emergence of the, on a conscious level, of the fundamental assumption of the self, which always has been in operation and which has, during this period of unconsciousness, been present in a latent form, a latent pre-conscious way. It now emerges as conscious experience, and the mind thinks, I am. And as a logical extension to that, I have a body. I am embodied in some way. I am present in some way. This is the phenomenon which is known as the mental body of the Bardo state. The mind feels as though it is physically embodied. There is no flesh and blood physical basis for the consciousness on any objective level at this point. The mind simply feels as though it has a body and projects the image of a body or form. And so this level of name and form refers to the fact that the mind becomes aware of itself in a sense as an ego. It again experiences itself as something real, and therefore embodies itself in accordance with its usual tendency to feel, I am present, I am like this. This stage of experience is what is known as the Mingji Pungpo in Tibetan, which literally means the skanda or aggregate of 4 names, literally. What this refers to is that these 4 stages of ignorance, of formation or stirring, of consciousness, and of actual form or embodiment have taken place. And because of this 4-fold process, there is now this aggregate of experience. There is this mind experiencing itself as an ego embodied in a particular form, which has nothing but an entirely subjective basis for the assumption that it is real. It is simply that the mind assumes that it is embodied. The next level, the next link or nidana in this chain is what is termed the 6 sense fields, or the 6 ayatnas. Now, this particular term is sometimes used in describing our present state of physical embodiment and the way we perceive the world. One can break our experience down into 18 elements, 6 senses, each of which is composed of or requires the operation of 3 elements in order for it to be a complete perceptual situation. In the case of a human being, we have a physical embodiment with a certain objective reality perceivable by others and a certain objective reality to the physical world that we experience. We have the eye as the organ of sight, which, through the operation of visual consciousness, perceives form. So we have the 3 elements of the organ or faculty of sight, of vision, the visual consciousness, and the form which is perceived, the form which is the object of that particular sense organ or that particular sense field. And in each of the cases of hearing, of smelling, of tasting, of touching, and of thinking, there is this same operation of a kind of organ or faculty which experiences or comes into contact with a certain kind of object, and therefore experiences through that particular avenue of consciousness. In the case of this mind in the Bardo state, there is no physical basis. So we can eliminate all but the mental aspect. There is no physical basis, there are no eyes, there are no ears, and so forth. It is completely mental body. There is no objective reality to the world. What there is the mind creating the impression of a body and then going to the trouble of creating the impression of an outer world which that body, seemingly, experiences through what corresponds on our level to the eyes, to the ears, to the nose, to the tongue, to the nerves, the skin, to the mind itself. All of this seeming to take place in much the same way that we now experience all of these senses taking place. The difference is that in that state there is no physical basis for the consciousness. It is a completely mental projection. It is a presupposition on the part of the mind that it has this form at all that can experience in all of these different ways. And so we only speak of 6 ayatnas, 6 sense fields. because there is no physical organ or physical object required for there to be a complete perceptual situation. The mind simply creates the impression of an eye, creating the impression of seeing a form. There really is all that we can talk about, all that we can talk about are the 6 psychological factors: visual consciousness, auditory consciousness, and so forth. Once there is this frame of reference, then, where the mind is projecting this impression of a body and projecting this impression of a world which that body is experiencing, even though there is no physical basis, once there are these 6 sense fields, these 6 avenues of consciousness, then the next stage is the actual contact between any one or all of those avenues of consciousness and their respective objects. The word which is used, rekpa in Tibetan, literally means to touch, means contact. In the same way that when we touch something with our finger, we make contact with it. We touch it, touch upon it. In this way, the sense faculties, or avenues of consciousness in the bardo state, make contact with their respective objects, which at this point are nothing but the projection of mind anyway. The mind projects an object and then seems to make contact with it. From the point of view of the mind, this is something outside which it is reaching out and touching, or making contact with through any one of the avenues of consciousness. What happens because of that contact is that a certain sensation is produced. The next step in the spectrum is that the mind perceives that object as something either agreeable or disagreeable, pleasant or unpleasant, hot, cold, whatever. There's a certain kind of sensation. Based upon that, there is a kind of grasping or acceptance of the situation as being real. There is a certain feeling towards that agreeable or disagreeable situation, object, which is perceived as being out there and with which contact is being perceived as being made. Then there is a stage which is known as actual grasping, of actually seizing the situation, a total acceptance of, yes, this is the case, I like that or I want that. In the case of a person, for example, they see a fruit. First there is the organ of sight and that avenue of consciousness that makes contact with that particular object. Then there is a sensation based upon that. Perhaps the fruit looks good to eat. Then there is more of an acceptance of the situation. Yes, that fruit is good to eat. And then there is, yes, I want to eat that fruit, and the fruit is taken up. So there is this spectrum that the mind experiences in the bardo state. In the particular case of the mind in the bardo state, the after-death state, this grasping is what propels the mind towards physical incarnation, the process of rebirth, for example, in the womb of the mother, conception in the womb of the mother, or whatever. The mind is moved towards that state of re-embodiment on a physical level by the stage which we term grasping, or clinging to the situation, reaching out for that situation. And in this particular case, the most critical stage of that is involved in the process of actual conception into physical rebirth. In the case of the consciousness in the bardo state, this mental body, which is the result of this four-stage process from ignorance through stirring or formation in the mind to consciousness to embodiment on a mental level, the mind then goes through this process of expressing itself in different avenues of consciousness which make contact with their respective objects, based upon which sensations are perceived, based upon which there is an acceptance of that situation as something real, based upon which there is a kind of craving, a kind of clinging to that situation, grasping. To take a very prosaic, very obvious example, it's like reaching out and grasping something that one wants. If one wants to take something, one reaches out and grabs it, grasps it. In the same way, the mind begins to take hold of situations. It begins to seize situations. And this is the psychological factor which is predominant in the taking of physical rebirth, in the case of a human being, in the womb of the future mother. Now, we could think of this grasping in a sense of the mind reaching out for the situation, or we could think of it as a force that propels the mind towards the situation. Depending on how we look at it, the practical result is that the mind incarnates in the womb in a physical basis. The person is, or that mind is conceived as a human being, in the case of the hypothetical example we're using of a human being. Now, as part of that process of grasping, of the mind moving towards that state of physical incarnation, there is an emotional reaction towards the parents. The nature of the bardo experience, of the after-death experience, is such that the mind has some kind of unconscious, or rather uncontrollable premonition of birth taking place, physical birth taking place. In the case of a mind that will take rebirth as a human being, there is the experience of the mother and father in sexual union, as though the mind were actually seeing them, were actually witness to the sexual act. As the mind draws towards that point, that moment of conception, there is an emotional reaction towards the parents. If the karmic makeup of the person is such that the mind will take rebirth in a male body, as a male child, the reaction will be one of attraction towards the female parent and aversion towards the male parent. As part of the conception process, it is the emotional charge, we might say, of a male rebirth. In the case of a female rebirth, a female child, the emotional charge will be completely the opposite. There will be attraction towards the male parent and aversion to the female parent. Regardless of which of these two cases applies, there is this emotional charge, which is part of this grasping process as the mind is propelled towards, or if we look at it another way, grasps, moves towards that conception.
yaris. Tene chene chara ritala, tene chegi tomarga, ito tomarga, tongu tomar, koa kamasini, nezi tudo yaris. Tene nezi tene kala, koa kamaga tomateri, nezi ndondo yaris. Ta taga chate kala, nezi pupate do, tene tata nezi tumba yate, chichi tuye tego, santedo, titong toma nezi pupa, tesin goye nezi ndedo yaris.
This process of conception, in the case of a human being in the womb, is the next nidana, which is known as becoming, taking birth. Now, in the case of a human organism, there is a process of assimilation when we take in nourishment. When we ingest food or drink as a means of nourishing the body, there is a sevenfold process of assimilation which is described as taking place over 7 days, over a period of 1 week, each stage taking 24 hours. The nutritive essence of the food and drink first being taken into the bloodstream during the first 24 hours. And from there, the essence passing into the muscle tissue, the flesh of the body, over the next 24 hours. From there into the adipose tissue, the fat and cartilage, over the next 24 hours. From there into the bone tissue. From there into the marrow tissue. And from there into a stage, the 6th stage, which is known as the red and white bindu, which are intimately associated with the presence of sexual cells in the male and female human body, the spermatozoa and the ova. The 7th stage of refinement produces a very subtle essence which pervades the entire body, which contributes to the healthy glow of a healthy organism, a healthy physical organism, and contributes to psychological and physical experiences of happiness, well-being, contentment, and so forth. Now, in the case of conception, it is this 6th stage which is most significant, because it is at this 6th stage that the sexual cells of the mother's and father's bodies are produced, the union of which provides the physical basis for that consciousness in the after-death state. So the process of conception, then, is this mental embodiment, this mind in the after-death state embodying itself in this compulsive way, actually uniting with, in some manner, the physical bases for physical embodiment, that is to say, the sperm and the egg, the ovum being fertilized by the father's spermatozoa. There is not simply this physical basis, however. There is, in order for there to be complete conception, the element of this mental state of embodiment, which is propelled by or moves towards the state of physical embodiment. When all of these come together, we have a human being. We have a being, a mind that has taken physical birth into the human realm. This level, then, of becoming, of physical rebirth, represents a certain solidification, in a certain sense, stabilizing factor in the experience of this mind in the bardo state. The mind in the bardo state is like a feather or a piece of paper in the wind, blowing hither and yon without any pattern to it, a completely chaotic state, completely helpless state, just like a feather in the wind being blown wherever the wind happens to blow, with no control over the situation. Now, at a certain point, it is possible that that feather, or that scrap of paper in its travels, is pushed against glue or mud, something to which it sticks, and it remains there for a while. Now, in the case of the mind moving through the bardo experience, it is a completely mental state of experience with no physical basis, but at a certain point, the impulses in the mind direct it towards a certain state where it sticks to something in a psychological sense. In this case, it sticks to the fertilized egg cell in the mother's womb. It sticks to that physical basis. It becomes temporarily, for a certain period of time, united with that physical basis. That is the process of becoming. That is this nidana of becoming, taking existence, which represents a certain stability. The mind is no longer completely buffeted around in this purely mental state, but there is some solid physical basis for the experience at this point. In the case of a being whose mind enjoys the experiences of predominantly positive karmic makeup, the experience of gestation in the womb, the growth of the fetus, and physical birth may not be a painful experience at all. It's quite possible it will be a very pleasant one for the fetus during its stages of development. The tendency is, however, for the fetus to experience a great deal of pain and suffering simply by the restrictions imposed upon it by the womb environment, simply by that process itself. We can appreciate in the last states of pregnancy what a fetus must feel like being cramped, being unable to move. It is just as though we were in a position where we are accustomed to being able to stretch our legs out when crossing them becomes tiresome, and then drawing them in again when stretching them out becomes tiresome, and then we're suddenly bound up and unable to move a bit. We know what that would feel like. In a certain sense, then, we can sympathize with the fetus in the womb experiencing that for a number of months, that inability to move at all during the later states of pregnancy. Up to this point, then, we have examined 10 of these 12 nidanas, or links, beginning with fundamental ignorance, passing through these formations, or samskaras, in the mind, emerging as full-blown consciousness, which embodies itself, expresses itself in a kind of mental embodiment, which then begins to manifest different avenues of consciousness, which then make contact with their respective objects, producing certain sensations, which are then accepted or responded to, which then leads to a kind of grasping or clinging to the situation, which then gives rise to this process of becoming. Now, the next logical step is that once the being is conceived in the womb and goes through this process of becoming, that at a certain point it takes birth. It is physically born into the world once it becomes able to function as an independent unit independent from the mother's body. And this, again, is, by and large, a painful process. It is not an enjoyable experience for birth to take place. However, for the mind of the being going through this process of being born and experiencing this suffering, once it is over, this is something which is largely forgotten. It is certainly experienced at the time as conscious pain while it is happening. But even the memory of birth is something that most of us are not capable of. Once it is past, it is past. We have emerged into the physical world as complete individuals, separate from the mother's body, and then it is finished. Now, what is implied by birth taking place is that many other processes come into being at that point. One begins to age. Not in the sense of getting old in the ordinary term, but aging from the moment of birth. There is the process of sickness, that the body goes through many different states of imbalance and disease and so forth in this life. all kinds of physical and mental pain which develop. All of these due to the fact that birth has occurred, that the being has emerged as a fully blown individual into a physical world in which that being goes through its life experiencing these different processes of aging, of disease, of illness, of injury, and so forth, towards, inevitably, death. In order to understand the relentless, moment-by-moment nature of this process, we don't need to look further than our wristwatch. We can just look at the hands sweeping around the dial, 1 second after another, relentlessly, and there's no way anyone can stop that. From the moment we are born, we are inevitably marching towards that moment of our death. We have no idea when that is. There is no guarantee that it will be at such and such a time or another time, but we do know that it will occur, and we do know that every second that passes, we are 1 second closer to it. Regardless of whether old age is the ultimate cause of one's death, or whether it is an accident or a disease, sooner or later one does die. Until such time as one does die, one experiences many different kinds of pain and suffering and frustration in this life, and the process of death itself is very painful. And so in describing this cycle of the 12 links, the Buddha spoke very much of the pain and suffering as part of this 12th nidana. We've seen in this progression from fundamental ignorance through samskaras or formations in the mind, the stirrings of consciousness, leading to full-blown discursive consciousness, leading to a sense of embodiment, though on a purely mental or subjective level. The expression of that as different avenues of consciousness, establishing contact with different forms of perceived objects, creating sensations, which are then accepted or responded to, leading to a sense of clinging or grasping to the situation, of being propelled into a kind of becoming, which is, in our case, the physical conception in the womb, leading to birth, which therefore leads to aging, suffering, and finally death. Our experience during this whole life, from conception and birth to death, then, is a process in which the mind, which embodies what are termed the 5 elements of our experience, earth, water, fire, air, and space, which embodies in its own nature these 5 elements, expresses itself through a physical level, which is again composed of these 5 elements, in relationship to a world which is composed of these 5 elements. Now, the development of mind and body, there's a parallelism here, where the conscious experience of the individual and the physical experience of the individual experience or undergo a kind of growth, a kind of development in the early part of the life, which is like a flower growing until it finally blooms and opens up and is at the absolute peak of its beauty, of its vitality. And this is young adulthood, when the physical organism becomes full-blown with all of its powers, all of its faculties, with the consciousness and intelligence at its finest, and then immediately there begins a decline. There is a peak moment, just as there is when the flower opens, and then the flower begins to wither and becomes old and dried up. In the same way, the human individual begins with all of this force and vitality, growing, expanding, developing, becoming more and more sophisticated, up to a certain peak point, following which there is gradual degeneration and decrepitude setting in, until finally death occurs. When death occurs, it is a process of these 5 elements being absorbed one back into the other. It is a dissolution process of all that went before.
그래 내가 되겠죠. 제컴 나라 통도 가서라 되는 다다 청파도 청파도 쳐왔다 되겠죠. 되네 나라 통도 가서 맞지 뭐 되네 저는 했지 통제 쳐서 왔다 되네 나카라 통도 가서 되네 나카반 사지도 안 들는데 쳐서 잡았다 다 된다고 저는 처음으로 맞았을 때네 탈 때네 요 말이 빨랐다고 야레스 때네 자가 야레스 다 들었는데 좀 좋다레스.
The process of dissolution is one in which the element of earth first dissolves and is absorbed into the element of water, the next most subtle element. From the subjective point of view of the dying person, the experience is of an intense pressure, a crushing pressure, as though a heavy load of earth or a huge mountain were pressing down upon the person's body. This is their own subjective experience of this stage. Following this, the element of water dissolves and is absorbed into the next most subtle element, that of fire, during which time the subjective experience of the person is that of drowning, of being inundated or flooded. Following this, the fire element dissolves and is absorbed into the air element, during which time the person experiences an intense burning sensation, as though they and the entire world were being consumed in flames. Following this, the air element dissolves into space, during which time the person's consciousness feels as though it were absorbed or caught in a huge windstorm, a hurricane. And following this, the element of space dissolves into consciousness itself, following which there is this blackout at the moment of death, where the mind is resolved back into its most fundamental level of ignorance. And at this point we have come full circle. We have exhausted the 12 links and returned to the first. This way of understanding the 12 links, the 12 nidanas of interdependent causality and coordination, is a way of explaining the cycle of samsara. This is, we might say, the personal aspect of samsara. That there is this cycle that always returns the mind to the same place, to the same experience, the same kind of experience. From this ignorance to which the mind has now returned, formations can develop, will arise, leading to the experience of consciousness, leading to the experience of mental embodiment, to the avenues of consciousness, and so forth. The whole process will take place again, and again, and again, over and over again. It is a vicious cycle which cannot be broken. It is the process through which the mind is forced to go again and again and again in an ongoing, repetitive cycle, infinitely, without end. That is one definition of samsara. That is perhaps the personal definition of samsara, that the mind of the individual being experiences these different parts of the spectrum over and over and over again. There is what we might call a more public definition of samsara, and that is this view of the 6 realms, 3 higher and 3 lower, which represent the possibilities of physical rebirth for that mind, the different gates through which that mind may emerge into physical waking existence before passing once again into the after-death state and then into another state of physical existence. At this point, then, we have the idea of a cycle because there are these 3 higher and 3 lower realms through which the mind is constantly moving in one or the other. This is perhaps a grander version of samsara, a more public, more collective version of samsara, but it remains this closed circle, which the mind will continually experience as long as that is not transcended, as long as some process of liberation does not take place. That is what we as samsarans, as beings in the cycle of existence, experience on both a personal, public, and a public level, this constant process of taking physical rebirth in one or another of the 6 realms of existence. It's worth noting that these 12 nidanas represent a process which is self-perpetuating. You don't have to wind it up the way you do a watch. It just happens by itself, one stage following the other. Given that it is important to acquaint oneself with the different concepts of Dharma and the different approaches, it is particularly in view of what is termed the intermediate vehicle, the Pratyeka Buddhayana, that this concept of the 12 nidanas is most important. It is in the teachings on this level that one will find these concepts of the 12 links most emphasized and most used as a subject or basis for meditation. The way this is used in actual practice is by following the process through in its normal progression and then reversing the trend. First of all, one would examine in meditation just the kind of progression that we've been examining today, beginning with the first element of ignorance and following through to the ultimate result of that process, which is the death of the physically incarnate individual. But at that point, one reverses the trend and says, well, fine, given that death has occurred or will occur as an inevitable result of this process, where does that come from? Why is death necessary? Death is necessary because aging and sickness take place. Why do aging and sickness take place? Because physical birth took place. Why did physical birth take place? Because conception took place in the first place, the physical embodiment, the taking of physical existence. Why did that take place? And so forth, working backwards until one comes to the cause of this whole mess, this whole cycle, fundamental ignorance. Where did that come from? That arises from the mind. What is the nature of mind? And at that point, ideally, the individual practicing on this level of the intermediate vehicle will absorb their awareness not in a state of fundamental ignorance, but passing beyond that to an awareness of emptiness, the emptiness of mind, the emptiness of the self, and so forth, and arriving at the at least partial state of enlightenment of a Pratyeka Buddha. Someone who arrives at that discovery through first working through this process of the 12 links and then working backwards, reversing the trend to arrive at the root of the whole problem and then cut through that root. We find ourselves then between these two significant events of our birth and our death. We are still in the waking state of existence, which represents, from our point of view, perhaps the longest and most fruitful period of time that the mind is ever going to spend throughout this whole cycle of the 12 links. It is during this waking state of existence, while it lasts, between birth and death, that we have the opportunity to study and to practice the Buddha Dharma, to begin the process of liberating the mind from that whole vicious circle. That seems to be the most significant use to which that state can be put.
다른 기타 본지들 그라트 버스나 선자도 다 책으로 봐봐지 비슷하게 하래. 그래서 자기는 많이 쓴 게 자와 공에 봐도 컨트롤도 그러지. 지금 나가 최신하고 그랬어. 저는 그래서 좀 저를 가수를 대화 하나스.
While it is true that the attainment of enlightenment is a mental act, a mental experience, that it is the mind attaining enlightenment, on a very practical level, we have a physical body on the one hand, based upon which there is speech and communication possible. We therefore experience not only this mind, but a body and speech. These are the three faculties, the three levels upon which an individual operates. Now, given that we have these tools, they can be used in an effective way. This means that the decisions in one's life to behave in certain ways, positively or negatively, will take place on three levels: physical, verbal, and mental. This means that the involvement in one's spiritual practice will take place on three levels: physical, verbal, and mental. So one's involvement in spiritual practice should not ignore the fact that while it is principally or primarily a mental process, physical and verbal practices and techniques and approaches form a very effective basis for that mental transformation. Perhaps on that note, then, we could simply conclude the afternoon session with the prayers for the dedication of the merit of this event.